She's breathing. No, she's not breathing anymore. There's blood. Blood everywhere. When police arrived, they didn't just find a body. They found blood spatter reaching the ceiling, dried stains across every step. And in the woman's hand was a clump of her own hair, torn out at the root. That was when the nightmare began. And the suspect? He was standing right there in a tank top and shorts, shivering in the cold, but not a drop of sweat. This would become one of the most complex, unsettling cases ever studied. The Staircase. Part 1. Blood on the Stairs. At 2:40 a.m., on the 9th of December, 2001, emergency dispatch in Durham, North Carolina, received a call from Michael Peterson, reporting that his wife, Kathleen Peterson, had fallen down the stairs. 7 minutes later, first responders arrived at the residence on Cedar Street. They found the body of a woman at the foot of a narrow interior staircase, with blood distributed across multiple surfaces, including the stair treads, risers, walls, and baseboards. The volume and distribution of blood exceeded the expected output from a simple fall. The presence of arterial blood spatter extending vertically on the wall, as well as coagulated pools near the head and shoulders, suggested extended hemorrhaging and prolonged activity at the site of collapse. There were signs of cast-off patterns, indicating movement during or immediately after bleeding began. Blood droplets on the inner side of an adjacent door and several feet away from the body raised the possibility of secondary contact or displacement. Kathleen Peterson was found in a supine position, her head resting on the bottom stair. Her limbs were positioned inconsistently with an uncontrolled fall. A clump of her own hair was discovered clenched in her right hand. Several strands were pulled from the root, with visible follicle tissue attached. This is a pattern associated with physical struggle or forceful contact involving scalp trauma. Preliminary visual inspection of the body revealed multiple lacerations to the scalp. A later autopsy confirmed 7 distinct deep lacerations on the posterior cranium, along with contusions and abrasions inconsistent with the linear geometry of the stairwell. No skull fractures were found, and the cervical spine remained intact. However, the thyroid cartilage showed signs of fracture, often indicative of compressive force applied to the neck. The observable absence of blood in the upper stairwell suggested the injuries did not occur while ascending or descending the steps. Blood trails started from the midpoint downward, with interruptions in the pattern implying staged repositioning. The delayed reporting interval between the alleged fall and the emergency call was approximately unverified, but remains a key temporal anomaly. Michael Peterson, the only individual present in the home at the time, claimed his wife had been drinking and likely fell accidentally. Toxicological analysis later identified only trace amounts of alcohol in her system, equivalent to a single glass of wine. This level would not typically impair balance to a degree sufficient to result in catastrophic injury. The totality of the physical evidence, blood distribution, wound morphology, item placement, and sequence of interaction demonstrates a set of conditions not commonly observed in accidental falls. The victim's injuries are not consistent with blunt force impact from a single surface, but suggest repeated blows with a narrow, non-sharp object. The vertical directionality of the spatter and absence of defensive wounds suggest limited physical resistance at the time of trauma. The scene exhibited no forced entry, no signs of burglary or home invasion, and no displaced items indicative of a struggle involving more than one person. No murder weapon was recovered from the vicinity. Law enforcement secured the residence and initiated a homicide investigation within 24 hours. The configuration of the scene and nature of the evidence prompted immediate attention from both local and national forensic professionals. Analysts noted discrepancies between the alleged timeline, the victim's physical condition, and the scene environment. The implication of deliberate manipulation was not supported by a single conclusive item, but by the accumulation of inconsistencies within the physical trace record. The absence of forced entry, combined with uninterrupted occupancy by a single individual, may reflect premeditative behavior shaped by familiarity with the physical space and predictive assumptions about investigative response. Part 2. The Perfect Husband. Michael Peterson was born in 1943 in Tennessee. He later earned a degree in political science and served in the United States military during the Vietnam War. After his discharge, he worked briefly for the Department of Defense before relocating to West Germany, where he lived with his first wife and their 2 sons. During this period, he formed a close relationship with a neighboring family. Following the deaths of both neighbors under separate circumstances, he adopted their 2 daughters and returned to the United States. Upon his return, Peterson settled in Durham, North Carolina, where he met Kathleen Atwater. Kathleen held an executive position at a telecommunications company and was widely regarded as professionally competent and socially assertive. She had previously divorced and was raising a daughter from that marriage. Peterson and Kathleen married in 1997 and moved into her residence on Cedar Street, a large property situated in an affluent neighborhood. Publicly, the household was perceived as cohesive and prosperous. The couple raised 5 children together, combining offspring from previous marriages and adoptions. Observers described frequent social gatherings, apparent familial harmony, and no known history of domestic conflict. Peterson maintained a presence in local media as a novelist and columnist, often commenting on political issues and military affairs. His writings presented an image of intelligence, stability, and moral clarity. At the time of the incident, no prior complaints or police reports of domestic disturbances were recorded at the Peterson residence. Financial records, however, indicated underlying instability. Despite outward affluence, the couple held significant debt, including credit liabilities exceeding $140,000. Kathleen was the sole income earner, and the household expenses reportedly outpaced her executive-level salary. Peterson did not maintain formal employment during this period. He instead engaged in writing and personal pursuits. His self-assigned role in the household was informal and largely symbolic. This divergence between perceived authority and actual contribution may have generated latent tension within the relationship. Financial dependency, combined with the maintenance of a curated social image, may represent an early behavioral divergence from normative spousal dynamics. Subsequent investigation revealed online activity by Peterson that included explicit communications with male escorts. Archived messages indicated planned in-person encounters, including one scheduled for the night Kathleen died. There was no documented agreement between the spouses allowing for extramarital sexual activity. The presence of such behavior, coupled with concealment, introduces a second behavioral anomaly: compartmentalization of identity and intentional withholding of information within an intimate partnership. This compartmentalization aligns with observed traits in certain psychobehavioral profiles, particularly in subjects who seek to maintain dual reputational constructs, public versus private. The tension created by sustaining such constructs often results in cognitive strain, which can contribute to situational volatility if confronted or exposed. In social settings, Peterson continued to perform the role of a supportive spouse and engaged father. Photographs, correspondence, and testimonies from acquaintances depict a man invested in the appearance of domestic stability. However, the progressive emergence of concealed behaviors, financial dependence, secret sexual activity, and strategic emotional distancing suggests a psychological dissonance between identity presentation and internal reality. The alignment between external projection and internal instability remains a critical factor in the behavioral analysis of this case. Patterns of sustained concealment, economic passivity, and reputational maintenance may point to long-term cognitive adaptation strategies rather than reactive behavior. The degree to which Kathleen Peterson was aware of these concealed aspects remains contested. The absence of documented confrontation, either verbal or digital, limits the scope of retrospective behavioral analysis. Whether she had begun to uncover elements of Peterson's concealed behavior in the hours preceding her death remains subject to further examination. Part 3. The cracks beneath. In the days following the incident, investigators began to identify inconsistencies in Michael Peterson's narrative regarding the events of the night Kathleen Peterson died. His initial statement to law enforcement claimed that after drinking wine together by the pool around midnight, Kathleen entered the house alone. He remained outside to finish a cigar, then re-entered the residence approximately 45 minutes later and found her at the bottom of the staircase. This version differed from his earlier statement during the emergency call, which implied that he had followed her inside shortly after she left the pool. The discrepancy in the reported timeline, combined with the advanced coagulation state of the blood observed at the scene, introduced a temporal conflict that could not be reconciled without further examination. The variation in narrative suggests an attempt to adjust perceived response time to match forensic indicators, a pattern consistent with post-event cognitive reconstruction rather than spontaneous reporting. Subsequent examination of Peterson's digital records revealed email communications with multiple male escorts. One exchange, dated hours before Kathleen's death, indicated plans for a meeting that night. The behavioral pattern of maintaining concealed sexual activity, alongside a projected image of monogamous domestic life, points to intentional identity segmentation. This segmentation was maintained through consistent avoidance of disclosure and operational separation between digital communication and in-person interaction within the household. The concealment of such communications from a spouse over an extended period suggests both calculated behavior and risk normalization. Peterson's ability to engage in these parallel behaviors without detection reflects a high level of internal compartmentalization. This behavioral trait is significant when assessing motive, especially under the assumption of potential exposure or confrontation occurring proximate to the event. Financial records obtained during the investigation indicated that the Peterson household was experiencing sustained economic strain. Their collective debt exceeded $140,000, with most financial obligations attributed to consumer credit and mortgage liabilities. Kathleen Peterson's income supported the household, while Michael Peterson's literary career generated negligible earnings during the relevant period. Evidence of financial stress, combined with emerging risks to social image and reputational integrity, contributes to the formation of a contextual motive model. The convergence of escalating debt, concealed extramarital behavior, and possible discovery by the spouse represents a compound stressor matrix. Within this matrix, an unplanned or impulsive act of violence may emerge as a maladaptive conflict resolution mechanism in individuals exhibiting high-level identity control combined with situational rigidity. Peterson's behavioral response post-incident also presented anomalies. Observers noted a mismatch between verbal expressions of grief and observable affect during interviews and public appearances. His speech remained coherent and composed, lacking physiological markers of acute psychological shock. This behavior does not constitute proof of intent or deception, but introduces a deviation from expected stress responses in cases of sudden loss involving a spouse. The investigative team noted the absence of physical indicators on Peterson's body, such as defensive wounds or blood transfer consistent with attempted resuscitation. The lack of such markers raised questions about proximity to the body prior to emergency personnel arrival. His clothing at the time shorts and a tank top was unstained in areas where direct contact with a bleeding individual would typically produce visible traces. This discrepancy between expected and actual physical evidence introduces a secondary inconsistency, reinforcing the need for behavioral coherence analysis. When situational narrative, physical interaction, and environmental trace evidence diverge, the likelihood of narrative engineering increases. At this stage in the investigation, the emergent behavioral profile consisted of sustained identity bifurcation, response pattern modulation, and active narrative reshaping. These traits form a pattern frequently associated with high-functioning individuals employing compensatory strategies to manage conflicting self-states under stress. The degree to which Kathleen Peterson became aware of the concealed aspects of her husband's behavior, and whether that awareness played a direct role in the precipitating event, remained analytically inconclusive. However, the behavioral indicators suggest that the integration of social, financial, and relational pressures had reached a threshold condition requiring further forensic and psychological modeling. Part 4. The Street Air Case. Again, during the ongoing investigation into Kathleen Peterson's death, detectives conducting a comprehensive background inquiry identified a previous fatality involving a woman closely associated with Michael Peterson. In 1985, Elizabeth Ratliff was found deceased at the bottom of a staircase in her home in Grunstadt, West Germany. At that time, Peterson and his then-wife Patricia had been living nearby and maintained a close relationship with the Ratliff family. Michael Peterson was reportedly the last person to see Elizabeth Ratliff alive, having assisted in putting her children to bed the evening prior to her death. The initial cause of death was recorded as an intracerebral hemorrhage resulting in accidental fall. However, upon review of autopsy photographs and investigative documentation, Forensic analysts noted similarities between the trauma patterns on Ratliff's body and those observed in Kathleen Peterson's case. These included multiple lacerations to the scalp, concentrated posterior cranial injuries, and ambiguous blood distribution relative to the physical dynamics of a fall. At the request of North Carolina prosecutors, Ratliff's body was exhumed in 2003. A second autopsy was performed in Texas, where pathologists revised the manner of death to homicide. This reassessment was based on the nature and location of cranial wounds and the absence of pathological indicators consistent with natural causes such as aneurysm or spontaneous hemorrhage. The introduction of a prior case with analogous features altered the behavioral context of the current investigation. The repetition of staircase-related fatal head trauma involving two women with close personal ties to the same individual under non-identical but comparably ambiguous circumstances constitutes a behavioral pattern. While not establishing causation, the recurrence of structurally similar fatalities within a limited relational and temporal field supports consideration of thematic reinforcement in offender decision-making. This behavioral recurrence suggests possible prior reinforcement or learning, wherein a previous ambiguous fatality may have established cognitive templates for method, opportunity, and post-event explanation. The lack of prosecutorial action in the Ratliff case in 1985 could have contributed to reduced perception of risk in potential replication. In parallel to these developments, an alternate hypothesis emerged suggesting that Kathleen Peterson's injuries may have been caused by an animal attack. Specifically, proponents of this theory proposed that a barred owl, common in the Durham region, might have inflicted the lacerations on Kathleen's scalp. Proponents cited the presence of microscopic owl feather fragments and pine needles in hair samples collected during autopsy. They further noted the characteristic curvature and spacing of the lacerations aligned with the talon pattern of Strix varia. The owl attack theory was not introduced by law enforcement, but rather advanced by a neighbor of the Petersons with legal training. This alternative explanation was examined by forensic experts and biologists, with some acknowledging that barred owls have been known to exhibit aggressive behavior during nesting seasons. However, no documented cases exist in which such an attack resulted in multiple deep lacerations and subsequent fatal trauma compounded by stare-related impact. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, the owl theory introduces a plausible but statistically marginal explanation, relying on an external randomizing factor to account for injuries and environmental evidence. This theory does not address the delayed reporting, narrative inconsistencies, or behavioral concealment previously documented. Furthermore, the hypothesis does not resolve the issue of secondary blood displacement patterns inconsistent with immediate collapse. While the forensic merit of the owl theory remains debated, its existence influenced public discourse and introduced alternative narratives during jury selection and trial proceedings. The presence of multiple interpretations regarding cause and sequence of injury complicates prosecutorial framing but does not materially alter behavioral indicators established through prior evidence. The coexistence of two fatal incidents involving similar trauma in analogous domestic environments, combined with unresolved variables such as scalp trauma etiology and delayed emergency response, forms a matrix of behavioral ambiguity. This ambiguity warrants further analysis of risk normalization, opportunity recognition, and precedent-based escalation in repetitive actor behavior. Part 5. Guilty or free? The judicial proceedings in the state of North Carolina v. Michael Peterson commenced in 2003. The prosecution's behavioral model emphasized sustained deception, compartmentalized identity, and a premeditated response to escalating psychological pressure. The core argument rested on the incongruity between the injuries sustained by Kathleen Peterson and the environmental limitations of the staircase. Expert witnesses introduced blood pattern analysis, indicating repeated forceful impacts rather than a single accidental fall. Autopsy data highlighted scalp lacerations inconsistent with stair edge geometry and an absence of corresponding skeletal fractures, suggesting non-accidental trauma. During cross-examination, defense counsel attempted to recontextualize the injury pattern as a result of successive accidental impacts during a fall. A behavioral reconstruction proposed that Kathleen Peterson, under the influence of fatigue and mild alcohol intake, fell multiple times while attempting to regain footing. The absence of skull fractures was presented as compatible with this theory. However, the lack of contact smearing, inconsistencies in blood pooling, and the placement of blood in nonlinear vectors contradicted the fall hypothesis in forensic modeling. The prosecution introduced a secondary behavioral anchor with the presentation of the 1985 death of Elizabeth Ratliff. Although this event had previously been ruled accidental, the forensic and relational parallels allowed the jury to consider the potential for precedent-based behavioral normalization. While the events were temporally distant, the structural and contextual similarity, combined with the subject's position in both incidents, strengthened the prosecution's theory of patterned conduct. Michael Peterson's courtroom demeanor remained composed and coherent throughout the trial. His responses during direct and cross-examination lacked reactive volatility, which legal psychologists interpreted as behavioral regulation rather than emotional detachment. Family members offered conflicting testimony, with some supporting Peterson's character profile and others indicating unresolved tensions in the household prior to Kathleen Peterson's death. These relational inconsistencies further complicated jury interpretation of motive and intent. On the 10th of October, 2003, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. Peterson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Behavioral analysts noted that the conviction reflected a high threshold of inferred intentionality, grounded in the convergence of physical evidence, narrative inconsistencies, and prior behavioral indicators. The defense subsequently filed appeals challenging procedural elements in forensic testimony, particularly the validity of blood pattern analysis presented by a state expert. In 2011, the blood stain analyst who testified at trial, Dwayne Deaver, became the subject of a state investigation regarding multiple instances of forensic misrepresentation in unrelated cases. As a result, Peterson's conviction was vacated on grounds of evidentiary unreliability. A new trial was granted. However, in 2017, prior to the start of retrial proceedings, Peterson entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter, acknowledging that sufficient evidence existed for conviction without admitting guilt. He was released from custody on the basis of time served. This procedural resolution introduced a legal classification of the incident that was inconsistent with earlier behavioral assessments. Voluntary manslaughter, by definition, presupposes unpremeditated action under provocation or duress. The existing body of behavioral evidence, however, continued to support indicators of forethought, preparation, and narrative management. Post-release, Peterson participated in media interviews and documentary productions. Throughout these appearances, his statements maintained a position of factual innocence. His narrative focused on prosecutorial bias and forensic error, rather than engaging with the behavioral dimensions previously presented in court. This sustained denial, in combination with a consistent personal affect, suggests a high degree of internal narrative reinforcement. Such reinforcement is characteristic in subjects with strong self-regulatory frameworks and externalization coping strategies. The Peterson case illustrates the behavioral complexity involved when legal outcomes diverge from established forensic models. While the judicial system ultimately produced a resolution through negotiated plea, the foundational behavioral inconsistencies spanning identity bifurcation, response latency, and situational staging remain analytically relevant. The intersection of forensic uncertainty and psychological ambiguity in this case presents a challenge to standard classifications of domestic homicide. Behavioral patterns consistent with selective disclosure, reputational maintenance, and pre-event stress convergence are present. However, the absence of direct forensic linkage to intent renders the case an outlier within comparative typologies of spousal homicide. The behavioral data support a hypothesis of reactive violence masked by strategic concealment, but the legal outcome codifies the event as a lower threshold act. Cases such as this highlight the operational limitations of courtroom settings in addressing behaviorally complex incidents. The introduction of alternative causal models, such as the barred owl theory, further illustrates the impact of narrative plurality on juror perception and public interpretation. These models, while statistically marginal, dilute the interpretive coherence required for categorical resolution. In sum, the Michael Peterson case remains a subject of interest due to its convergence of forensic ambiguity, behavioral inconsistency, and legal reclassification. The sequence of post-incident behaviors, combined with evidentiary anomalies, supports the presence of narrative control and psychological insulation. However, the formal adjudication failed to establish a consensus model of intent.